Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Interpreting Table Talk. My name is Killian Sieber, and with us today from the International University of Rome, where she coordinates the MA Interpreting Track program and the Laboratory of Interpreter-Mediated Interactions, is Claudia Monacelli. Now, Claudia, you did your doctoral work in Edinburgh at Heriott-Watt. It was on conference interpreting, but your research interests lie in applied linguistics, in interpreting studies, sociolinguistics, pragmatics, with a special emphasis on epistemology and qualitative research tools. You've worked as a conference interpreter for about 30 years, and you're currently based in Rome. The book we're talking about today, but we'll be going beyond what's in the book, is called The Changing Role of the Interpreter, Contextualizing Norms, Ethics, and Quality Standards. And it's a book that you have co-authored with Marta Biagini and Michael Boyd. Contains 12 chapters, some very well-known names in there across the demographic and geographic spectrum. There's Dam, there's Scheffner, there's Turner, there's Gentile, Gilles, Zwischenberger, to mention only some of them. My first question to you is the following. Why this topic and why now? Is it more relevant now than it would have been, say, 10 or 15 years ago, or was there any particular event that triggered your idea to put together this book?
Well, you mentioned the LAREM research group, and in 2013 we organized a conference. It was 1 year after Miriam Schlesinger passed, and we commemorated her with that conference. And there is a surprise. It was a surprise for us to see first the turnout and the wide-ranging topics that emerged. And from there, after the conference was over, of course I put my thinking cap on and I started thinking of the deliverables, as they say. And it was important for me to to create, along with my colleagues from the LAREM group, a journal. We wanted to have a specialized issue, a special issue in a journal, and so that was done. And then 2 other volumes. And this was the last that came out about 3 weeks ago, I think. And the relevance, is it more relevant today than 10 years ago? Well, it is a changing role, and 10 years ago there were different roles, and the emergence of a certain specific professional role does come with it all of the research possibilities and potential. So yeah, I think it would be quite relevant today. But to get back to the reason behind the conference, the idea was that we invited colleagues to speak in areas that Miriam studied and her specializations, and that's what gave us the idea of doing this publication particularly.
So I understand you correctly that at least part of the rationale behind the volume was also to give credit to the work of Miriam Schlesinger.
Right, exactly. As a matter of fact, 2 of her protégés were present at the conference, and they wrote a chapter in another volume the year before in 2016, and that's true.
Now,
I hope she's around, Miriam.
I'm sure she is. The 15 authors that did contribute to the book obviously make up a motley crew. Different areas of expertise and different areas of interest. How would you say the overall project, now that you have the deliverable, how would you say the overall project fared in terms of, well, providing those or coming up with the deliverables that you mentioned before? Are you happy with the outcome?
I'm fairly, well, you know, at the end of a project, you're so happy that it's over, first of all. And but I'm particularly happy about this volume because the idea behind it, or the rationale behind it, was to create an interactive volume. So what we did was divided into four sections. The first 3 sections had the author's presentations. And the last section was a section where we invited discussants to review all of the chapters and have sort of take a critical stance. And that was risky. It was risky in more ways than one. It was risky at the beginning of the book project because Routledge, the publisher, didn't like that idea. And they kept giving it back, the proposal. Why do you need discussants? Who are they? What will they be doing? And so we gave them the names and they asked, have they committed? And when we said yes, then it was okay, for them. But I'm pretty happy about the outcome of that because it was interactive and it gave us as authors also, we learned a lot. We learned a lot about what they were talking about. But more than learning a lot about the topic itself, we learned a lot about how to give feedback to authors, young authors as well, and older authors who didn't have our mindset in terms of what was supposed to be on paper, black and white. That was a challenge. That was a real challenge.
You mentioned risk before, and I agree. It's probably rather risky to open up other people's contributions to comments.
Yes, very risky.
Did you do anything in particular to attempt and mitigate this risk upstream? How did you manage this risk? Did you give clear instructions to those who were then asked to comment on the articles?
Well, we didn't give them any preset guidelines. What we did give them were the chapters, and at that point I think there were 12, and asked them to touch upon anything they wanted to, any chapter at all. But if they didn't have, or weren't knowledgeable, or didn't have an area of expertise that was presented in the book, to just comment on what they wanted liberally, freely. And what was interesting was that one of the discussants was Daniel Gilles, and he, in a heartbeat, gave it back to me within 3 weeks. And that was helpful because it put me in a position of giving the other two discussants his chapters as a guideline, but it didn't condition them, and I was happy about that.
Very good. Now, you in the title summarize the main areas that the authors touch upon in the book: ethics, norms, quality standards. Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of highlights for ideally all three areas, or at least one or two of these areas where you think that really is something that came unexpected? I never thought it would be this good or this interesting, or I never thought I would get this angle.
Well, when you ask me about highlights, I keep thinking of the problems that we had. All of the problems that kept coming up.
That can be a highlight too, a negative highlight.
And because it was norms, ethics, and quality standards, of course, that's pretty wide, but there was that word contextualizing, so it really conditioned the authors to bring data, bring a context, and that was, let's say, a double-edged sword, because it gave them the box, and they wanted, many authors, and this is, I have to put myself in this, many authors want to bring their baggage, their luggage of knowledge, and put it in a box, and sometimes it doesn't fit. And so that was a really, really big challenge. And there are highlights, there are beautiful highlights, and part of the highlights are hidden behind the negative incidents that we had. For example, we had the idea behind the book was to have seasoned academics sharing space with younger researchers. And for example, the younger, we had a couple of cases where they had not finished their PhD program, and I believe, I want to think it's that. They had difficulty in structuring the work and focusing, so we had to change, we had to change authors, and that caused a lot of problems halfway through the project. And another beautiful highlight was the opening chapter that was written by Nitsa Ben-Ari, a friend, and it was it sort of was an introduction to the book, because it talks about fictional images of the interpreter versus professional interpreters. And when you talk about film and theater and books, it's hard to put your feet on firm ground as to how to cite that in a bibliography and the actual structure, because the idea is all so wide-ranging, and that gave us a big challenge to structure. But that was an interesting highlight. But if you want to talk about highlights, the best papers or the most interesting papers, I have to say that there is a paper by Christina Schaffner, who is one of the seasoned, like myself, academics involved, and I sort of singled her chapter out because she talks about metaphor. And, well, she talks first about the title, I think it is self-awareness of norms or something. And metaphors, in the use of metaphors in conferenze di stampa, press conferences. And what's interesting is that it's not only a very academic paper, it gives younger researchers the ability to see actually what is done in press conferences, but also gives them a micro-analysis to read and look at, and that they can emulate. And that was really, and it's so well balanced. It was a pleasure to read.
So, again, if I understand this correctly, the book serves multiple purposes. You mentioned yourself this idea of bringing together the more with the less seasoned researchers, so allowing the new generation of researchers to perhaps learn by imitation, or at least get some inspiration from those who've been around the block a few times, methodological insights, modeling, and perhaps also the candor to see that everybody struggles at some point. No paper is perfect from the get-go.
I would have liked a seasoned author to help me do the editing. That would have helped me when I didn't know how to deal with certain, issues, difficulties. I could have used an extra hand. But there were 3 of us, and we initially started with 2 authors, myself and Marta Biagini. And when the project kept coming back from Routledge, they wanted us to change the authors because we needed more global representation, and we needed more modes of interpreting that weren't represented in the book. So that meant throwing out half of our authors, and that took time. And they gave us names, first names and last names, and we had to go through that first. And so it took us back a year, and but then we stabilized. But why I say I could have used a hand in somebody tutoring me as to how to deal with editing. At one point, we were 3 months away from the deadline, and one of the discussants backed out because when we gave her the 12 chapters, maybe she just didn't realize how much work there was involved, and so she backed out. And that has never happened to me. It has never. I'll say that again. It has never happened to me, and I was really surprised. I was really, I felt bad, And who came to the rescue was actually Daniel Gini. He was a sweetheart in this, and he suggested Heli Dam. And she was so gracious in standing to the challenge. She wrote a beautiful chapter. I'd invite everyone to take a look at it. It's so well balanced. Similar. It was a tie between Christina Schaffner and Heli Dams, but Christina was the main author, and Heli was a discussant. But it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work of reasoning and critical assessment, which is interesting.
Now, different
you're
different
going to
chapters.
have to shut me off, or else I'll go on and on.
No, that's perfectly fine. That's the idea. Different chapters, 12 chapters, different areas, and yet, in terms of a deliverable, when you put together a book like this, particularly the way you've structured it with this novel or out of the ordinary approach of having discussants then look at what others have produced and connect some of the dots that the average reader might perhaps not have connected on his or her own. What do you think is one, or what are some of the trends that emerge, particularly also thanks to the discussant's work, but perhaps even without the discussant's contribution? This homogeneity, is it there?
Well, there was definitely a number of trends that emerged, and one idea, one construct that emerged across the board, all the discussants, was the notion of professional. And that wasn't in the title, but it was, they jumped on it as saying, there was no specification of what is professional, what is not professional, and that could be an underlying theme that needs to be addressed directly. And another trend that was actually embarrassingly absent, but it did emerge between the lines, was power and ideology in different fields and sectors, teaching, the press conferences, the deaf, and that was really relevant. It was the elephant in the room,
Who's going to, well, let me backtrack. Who did you have in mind as readership throughout, before you started, and
okay.
once you had embarked on
Yeah,
the project?
yeah,
Did it change
yeah.
from the very first thoughts about the project,
Yeah.
and then the end product? And
Yeah.
whom would you say you would want to pitch this to at
Well,
this
this is one of
at
the
this point?
things that you include in the book proposal, actually, when you write a book proposal, these long 5-6 pages. And one of the areas is the target population, and another is your greatest competitor, competing volumes. And there, since there was a lot of microanalysis, we pitched it to linguists, linguists, language specialists, and of course teachers of translation and interpreting, and academics. But it had a wide range, and students, because students are really able to be in a position of seeing how things are done, how they shouldn't be done, how they are done, and what can be improved. That I think is a positive side to the volume.
Now, both you and myself, we train first and foremost conference interpreters, or interpreters in general.
Right.
If we don't go as far as saying linguists in general, what are some of the lessons learned or good examples or best practices that the book might include that you would recommend some of the trainers take a particularly close look at? On your faculty, on my faculty, where are the areas where they can benefit? Where's the greatest added value?
Well, the greatest added value is that when you talk about norms, you talk about things that are done, or practices that seem to emerge in data that are done but we don't talk about. And they also see that norms are dictated, they're prescriptive. And so you get three sides to a coin. And the interesting part is that you get a chapter also that talks about norms being flouted, like Eugenia Dalfovo has written in a chapter. She's an assistant, she's an adjunct professor in Trieste now, and which is true. And well, for example, just one little example is that often in a three-party discussion, or where the interpreter is one of the parties, there is a norm, there's a practice that's called gatekeeping, and the interpreter is usually a gatekeeper. On television, that's flouted, because oftentimes the presenter will start talking in the language that the interpreter will be using, and the interpreter has no control over the direction of the dynamics, how the dynamics will develop. So there are a lot of little things that aren't taught in classrooms because the walls are too, tight. We don't get to that in classes.
If this is a big project, which it was, I take it was not the last project.
Yeah.
Meaning that you embark on something like this. You embark on something like this, you have certain expectations in terms of outcomes and deliverables. We talked about those very briefly. Where do you think, thanks to this project, you have seen areas that require more work? What avenues has this project opened up for you? Where is it pointing you? What's the next project, if you want to give it away?
It's easily said, because Laring Group now has organized a second conference, and the topic, the theme is on power and ideology. So that's an immediate, let's say, development of that. But I think that the avenues could also extend to curriculum planning and how to adapt curriculum planning seamlessly to the developing professional roles that occur, And what else is there? But these are, of course, books that you yourself can think about.
I'll give some thought to that. I'll give some thought to that. For the time being, I think we thank Claudia for having made her way to Geneva. It was a pleasure having you. And I'll see you all back for the next 30 talk.